So one of my favorite activities and hobbies growing up when I was a kid was putting puzzles together, like 1,000-piece puzzles. I think I got this from Grandma Brown. See, there were three things that were tried and true when you went over to Grandma Brown's house. There was candy in a dish, Garth Brooks was on the stereo, and there was a 1,000-piece puzzle somewhere on a table in her house that she was putting together. And so many afternoons, many days, I would spend at Grandma Brown's house eating candy, listening to Garth, and putting together 1,000-piece puzzles. And it became a real bonding experience for me and Grandma Brown. See, she would give me all the advice. She would say, you want to start with the edge pieces and get your border together first. You'd want to group similar color or looking pieces together so you have them all next to each other. But she gave me one piece of advice that I think was the most important, most impactful, not just for putting puzzles together, but for life in general too. She said this. She said, if you just find yourself staring at the pieces and you're stuck, look at the bigger picture. And she gave me this advice, and she would always have, all 1,000 pieces, the pieces would be scattered everywhere on the table, but she would always have the box propped up somewhere that she could see, and she would study the box, look at the puzzle, study the box, look at the puzzle, and she used the bigger picture on the box as her guide to help her. And while great for putting puzzles together, it's great advice, I think it's true for our lives too. That sometimes, I don't know about you, but for me at least, sometimes my life feels like a bunch of puzzle pieces all just laid out on a table, not quite sure how we're going to put it all together. But what I can do in those moments, what you can do in those moments, is to trust the bigger picture that God has. The bigger picture that there's a good and gracious God who's always at work, even when we can't see it. That there's a God who, even though we don't know how the pieces are going to fit together, there's a God who takes every piece and uses it for his good. That's the bigger picture we can trust. And we can trust him in that bigger picture, even when it comes to the pieces of our calling. So if you can remember 2 weeks ago, I know that feels like a lifetime ago. If you can remember 2 weeks ago, we started a series called Everyday Mission that Pastor West kicked off for us. And we talked about this idea of how we are called by God. And for the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about living that out and what that looks like. And really, this series was kind of founded and developed on this kind of anchor text that Paul writes in Ephesians 4 to the followers of the way of Jesus in Ephesus. And here's what Paul says. I want to invite you to look at this. Therefore, I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your what? Calling. For you have been what? Called by God. Always be humble and gentle. Be patient with each other, making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. For there is one body and one Spirit, just as you have been called to one glorious what? Hope for the future. Now, what I love about this text is, yes, it's really good words and really good wisdom, but this is written by a guy who's kind of lived this out and gone full circle. See, Paul wasn't always named Paul. Paul used to be Saul. And Saul lived a life that was chasing after another calling, if you will. He had another purpose in his life. And it was actually to harm and persecute followers of the way of Jesus. That was Saul's whole deal, was to find Christians, capture them, torture them, and more. That was his kind of job, if you will, the whole purpose of his life. But then, like many of us, he had an encounter with Jesus that changed his life. You had an encounter with Jesus that changed your life. Can I get an amen on that? Yeah, a lot of us have. He has this life-changing encounter with Jesus, and it was so transformative that he even had a new name. He went from Saul to Paul. And Paul lived his life for a different purpose, a purpose all about bringing hope. And that's what Pastor West reminded us of a couple weeks ago. I want to bring you back to it. Pastor West reminded us of this truth, that I'm called by God to bring hope in Jesus' name. What a great thing today, by the way, to be reminded of. That what's our calling? Our calling is to bring hope in Jesus' name. In a world full of divisiveness and negative stories and fear-mongering and so on and so on and so on, what a great reminder that our calling is to bring hope. It's not just Kairos and Kairos Outside's calling to bring hope. They bring hope to people too. It's our calling as followers of Jesus to bring hope in Jesus' name wherever we might find ourselves. We are people of hope. That's good news today. And with this truth, we know that we're called by God to bring hope in Jesus' name. We know that we're called. But if we're honest, even though we know we're called, we're still left with questions, because there's one thing that we can't just seem to get comfortable with, and it's this. It's the unknown. It's the unknown. We're uncomfortable with the unknown. And if you want evidence of this, I could list a lot of examples, but I want to look no further than technology and our best friend, at least my best friend, Google. Do y'all know Google? Do you have a best friend too named Google? Okay, good. I know I do. I saw these stats this week that blew my mind. I want to share them with you. So Google processes over 8.5 billion searches per day. That means there's 99,000 searches per second. Think about that. So ready? 99,000 searches on Google just right then. It's incredible, right? And while this has provided us with a lot of info, like now you can ask big questions of Google and also smaller questions of Google and get answers almost instantly, right? There's a shadow side to this too. See, we've exchanged the ability to get info and change our unknown to known almost instantly, but the shadow side of this is now we have an insatiable desire to know, well, everything instantly. Where we're getting less and less comfortable with being patient and waiting in the unknown. The unknown maybe causes us to get a little, get a little sweaty. Our palms start sweating. We start getting a little warm. We don't like it when we don't know something. And to be able to sit for a long time with that, well, it's uncomfortable. We don't like it. Technology is just one example of this. I mean, for me, it was these hurricanes over the past couple weeks. I mean, it felt like a game of waiting in the unknown. I was waiting in the unknown to see if Helene was going to hit us or we were in the cone. I was waiting in the unknown to see how bad Hurricane Milton was going to be. I was waiting in the unknown as Invest 94 was forming over in the Atlantic, wherever it was, and now it's a hurricane. It felt like a whole game of waiting in the unknown for these storms. And yes, there's a lot of stress that goes into this. There's evacuation plans, securing your home, filing with insurance, the damage, all that. But do you know what started getting to me the most? It was the unknown. It was not even Google could tell me what this storm exactly was going to do. There's an element of mystery, an element of unknown, and an element of question was at play. I even found myself, at some point last week, or the week before, really starting to spiral down this unknown, unhealthy place, where I just became obsessed with the unknown and the bad what ifs. I found myself struggling. Pastor Wes's sermon last week was so good for me personally to get right. If you missed it, I invite you to check it out. But to a certain degree, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a medical diagnosis, whether it's the loss of a loved one, whether it's the end of a career, a changing dream, a big move, whatever the case may be, unknown and uncertainty finds us in life, doesn't it? And it's ironic because we live in an age, I call it an age of certainty. We want everything to be certain, we want everything to be known, but yet life doesn't work that way. There's so much of life that's a mystery. There's so much of life that is unknown. And it can make us a little uncomfortable. I don't know what your go-to is in the unknown. Maybe you try to fight it and try to figure it out. For me, my go-to in the unknown is I freeze. Anybody else freeze? I'm guilty of just kind of like not doing anything productive. Please hear me. This is not like a healthy, he uses patience and discernment before making a rash decision. No, I'm just scared, so I freeze. Don't overhear it. Don't spiritualize it. I'm just scared I'm going to mess up, and so I don't do anything. And it can be true, too, even with God's calling for me, is I'll sometimes just wait until I have the clearest of all pictures before I do anything. And I even had an encounter with this, with this whole idea of freezing before, because I've found this advice to be true. In order to not freeze in the unknown, or freeze when something happens, you got to have a plan for how you're going to keep on moving. So during my sabbatical, I had a sabbatical a few months ago, got to go on some amazing trips, and one of my favorite trips that I got to go on was to Montana, to Glacier National Park. My wife Elisa and I got to go. We got to bike this incredible road called Going to the Sun Road. You can see a picture of us here at one of the places that we could stop and take a picture. And it's this amazing, beautiful bike ride, beautiful park. It was awesome. So we rented bikes from this little shop outside the park, and they pick you up, and they take you, and they have the bikes in the trailer. And so our tour guide, he's getting the bikes off the rack and getting them ready for us, and we're getting ready to start riding on the trail. And he nonchalantly, we're doing small talk, and he nonchalantly gets the bike off, and he says, "So, do you guys have a plan if you see a bear today?" I went, "What? A bear?" I said, "I want to go for a bike ride, not like play hide from the bear and don't be his lunch. I just want to ride my bike. He said, well, you got your bear spray. I said, well, I thought this was like just in case and to look tough. I'm like, you mean I need this? And he's like, oh, you're going to need that and more. I'm like, no. Because remember, my wife struggles with anxiety. So this conversation did not set us up well to go on the bikes in the park. So he begins talking, and the first thing he says is, listen, he said, you might see a bear, and you need to know this. Your initial reaction is going to be that you're just going to freeze. He said, your jaw's going to hit the floor, and you're just going to be like, oh, a bear. And he goes, well, what you shouldn't do is just stand there and do nothing and wait for the bear to find you. So he went on and explained all these different scenarios. I'm not going to share them with you, or you might never go to Montana. So if you want to ask me later. But he shares with me all these scenarios about what to do if we see a bear, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. And none of them included freezing there with, oh. So we didn't see a bear. But you know what? Thanks to his conversation, I felt like 1% more ready to encounter it if we did. Because his whole thing, this is an ex-military guy who's been in the park for 20 years. He said this. He said, trust me, if you have a plan to not freeze and to keep on moving, you'll keep on moving. And I thought, what good life advice too. In the face of the unknown, when my tendency at least, maybe for you too, is to freeze, what great advice to be able to know what we're going to do and be able to think about it now and have a plan for moving forward. So for the rest of our time together, when it comes to the unknowns in life, the puzzle pieces of our life laid across the table, I want to talk about what we can do to keep on moving. And I want to talk about, I want to use Abraham as our guide. Abraham is one of the heroes of the faith. He's one of, I would say, like the pillars of our faith that we know, one of the heroes of it. We're going to talk in a couple weeks about a flyover of Abraham's life as a whole. But I want to just talk today about his origin story, if you will. Abraham's call story. Because I think it can teach us some pretty incredible things about what to do in the face of unknown. What you need to know about Abram at this time, his name wasn't Abraham yet, it was Abram. So Abram at this time was living with his wife Sarai in a land called Haran, and he was about 75 years old at the time. And then all of a sudden, one day, God speaks to him and calls him to something pretty incredible. Let's look at it here. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, pretty extraordinary calling, isn't it? To leave his land, leave his people, leave what he knows, and go to a land that God will show. Now, we knew what God was calling him to. God was calling him to leave and go. But did you catch what was not known, what God didn't specify? Where he was going, which seems like important info, right? Seems like important info you need to know. So God calls Abram to go, but he doesn't tell him exactly where to go. Just he says, I'll show you the land. Now, people are wired in one of two ways. We're going to take a poll in a second to see who's who. One type of person is wired where they're a planner, and they have to know every single detail of every little thing. Like if you're going on a vacation, you got to have the itinerary and everything down to the minute. There's another wiring of people who don't need to know any of that. Very go with the flow, just kind of take life as it comes, see one thing happens after the next. Where are my planners wired? You got to know every little detail. Where are you at? Raise your hands. All right. Oh, here it comes. Here it comes. Where am I go with the flow people? Wow. I love you all, and I'm jealous of you all, because I'm not that, and I want to be really bad. I want to be go with the flow, but I'm hardwired. I got to have a plan. I got to know the details. And here's my assumption. No matter if you're hardwired to be a planner or if you're hardwired to be a go with the flow, God's request to you in that moment, if you're Abram, would kind of make you take a big gulp a little bit, right? It's a big deal. And think about it. Abram's not a spring chicken. He's not a 20-year-old in his traveling phase. He is 75 at the time. He is settled in this land. And so God calls him to this really big thing, and there's a big unknown in it. Now, while we can focus just on the unknown, we're going to come back to it. I want to focus, though, on what was known. Because God tells him exactly what he's going to do if he's obedient. Did you catch this part? You can put it back on the screen. We're going to highlight some of it. God tells him if he's obedient, he's going to be made into a great nation. God will bless him. We go to the next one. We see God continues this. God says he'll make his name, Abraham's name, great, and he will be a blessing to others. Now, tech team, keep this up for a second, because we honestly read this through our 21st century American lens, and we think like, okay, cool, name great. So Abram's going to be an influencer and be a blessing, like what, he's going to get rich and like do like cool, blessings for people, like give people stuff. That's our 21st century American lens. When we look through the original language of Hebrew for this, it actually takes on an even deeper and more beautiful meaning. So when you look in Hebrew for the phrase name great, like I'll make your name great, it doesn't mean that Abram's name is going to get elevated. What it means is that phrase is that his name will be, Yahweh will be magnified through the great things done in that name. Meaning like Abram's story is going to point directly back to Yahweh, to God. It's not about Abram becoming a celebrity. It's about what God's going to do and what God did do through Abram. And that phrase, be a blessing, it just means that God will shower his goodness over Abram and those who bless him. So I want you to understand what God is telling Abram here. God's telling Abram, take all your stuff, get up and leave, go to a land I'm going to show you that you don't know yet. And if you do, I'm going to do great things through you. And I'm going to shower my goodness upon you. We know that's what God was going to do. Even in Abram's questioning, that part was certain. Some of you today, you need to hear the fact that you've got questions about God. You got questions about your calling, your life, or the calling. You got a bunch of puzzle pieces laying on the table. Or maybe you have all 999 pieces in there, but there's one piece missing of your puzzle. You need to hear that even in your questions, God's still good and he's still gracious. He's still good and he's still gracious. And that bigger picture that he called you to, even though you don't know piece by piece, you can trust the bigger picture that he calls you to. That he's a God of love. He's a God that has your goodness in mind. Does it mean the road will be easy and perfect? Absolutely not. But it's a God that's in your corner. It's a God that has blessing for you, to shower his goodness on you. That's what you need to know today in the midst of your questions. So what would Abram do? Would he fight this? Would he freeze? Would he ignore? What would Abram's response be to God? The next verse tells us. So Abram went as the Lord had told him to. And Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. If you wanted to look at someone's life summed up in a sentence, it's that. It just displays Abram's consistent steadiness in following God, even when the whole path wasn't clear. What we see displayed from Abram here is obedience. It's obedience to God. And for some of us, we need to understand that this is really what obedience is. See, obedience to God is following him when the path isn't always clear. It's one thing to be obedient when we know step by step what's going to happen. And God says, I'm going to guide you to here, and here's how I'm going to do it. It's one thing to follow God then and be obedient. It's another thing to be obedient and follow God when the path isn't always clear. I'll give you a real life example of this. So a lot of us on our phones now, I would say almost all of us have GPS on our phones, right? Literally, we can pull up Maps or Google Maps or Waze, whatever you use. You can type in an address, and it will give you down to 1/10 of a mile the turn-by-turn directions. And you just type in the address and you follow it, and it tells you exactly how to get there. It'll tell you when to turn, tell you when to U-turn, tell you when to do anything, right? Now, we didn't always have GPS. Middle and high schoolers in the room, hold yourselves together. I know this is going to floor you, okay? Middle and high schoolers in the room, I'm going to have something that'll blow your mind. We didn't always have GPS. And back in what I've heard some of you call the dark ages, and that's the 1980s, if you were a normal civilian, you had to have one of these bad boys to get anywhere. Paper map. So here's how it worked. Maybe, I'm sure you all have great memories of this. I remember my dad. You got the big table, right? You got your counter. You got to unfold the map. fold after fold after fold. It felt like the thing went on forever. You got to unfold it. You had to find where you were, and you had to scale, figure out, like, okay, how many miles is this? Where do I take? Where do I go? Like, that was part of prepping for family vacation, the road trip. You couldn't just type in the address in Tennessee and just drive there. You had to, like, map out every single thing. Middle schoolers and high schoolers are like, oh, the horror. That sounds terrible. What hard work that is. Wow, how'd you survive? I don't know. We figured it out. It's one thing to have the GPS of your life, like turn by turn, here's where I am, here's where I'm going, boom. Those moments in my life with God have been few and far between. There have been some things where God has called me or led me to a certain thing, and I know exactly how it's going to play out. He's told me. But then there's other things. Most of my life is kind of like following Jesus with a paper map. Like I got to use some wisdom and discernment. It's not so easy as the direct turn by turn. Friends, that's the real measure of obedience. Obedience, yes, we can follow God when we get everything turn by turn and everything crystal clear. But if we want to talk about what a real measure of mature obedience is, it's following God even when the path isn't always clear. Which begs a question of why. Why did God not tell Abram the land he was going to? Why did he leave it a mystery? What was the point of that? Well, obviously none of us are God. And so we can't answer that from his perspective. But I'm going to wear my assumption hat for a second, and I'm going to answer it from a human, frail, imperfect, finite mind perspective. If I were in Abram's shoes and God told me the land I needed to go to, I would be trusting in just the information that God gave me. By God telling Abram, you're going to go to the land I will show you, Abram couldn't trust in information. Abram had to trust in the person of God. No one knew the land but God. So what was Abram doing? Abram was looking to God saying, God, I need you to guide me and lead me and show me. What if the mystery involved in this was not God trying to mess with Abram or punish him? What if the mystery involved in this, the question, the unknown involved in this, was an invitation for Abram to not trust in information, but to trust in God in a deeper way? Have you ever stopped to think about the things that you pray for that you wish you knew, what you'd do if you actually knew them? For myself, I have to wonder, would my prayers to God stop at that point? Because I would then know it, and I'd then rely on that. I want to invite you to look at obedience, to look at the unknown in a different way. What if the unknown isn't God cursing you or messing with you or trying to throw you for a loop? What if it's just an invitation to follow him more closely? The person of him, the presence of him, the power that he has. After all, we see the same invitation later on in the New Testament with Jesus. See, if you wanted a parallel to Abram's call story in the Old Testament in Genesis, we see Jesus calling the disciples in the New Testament. And there are a lot of similarities. We have these fishermen who are on a boat, who are in a land familiar to them, and a career that's familiar, and a life that's familiar. And then Jesus, whom they know at the time as a rabbi, comes up to them. And Jesus extends them an invitation that would change their life forever. He said this, he said, "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." And what did they do? They said at once they left their nets and followed him. Sounds very similar to, so Abram went as the Lord told him to, doesn't it? See, these disciples, think about it. The time they were fishermen, turned disciples after they said yes. Think about it. The instructions that Jesus gave, they said he told them he was going to have them fish for people. Now, a couple thousand years later, we can look at this text and go, oh, I understand what Jesus meant. In the moment, they were probably a little confused, weren't they? They're probably like, so does that mean I need the boat? Or like, can I leave that? Do I need the net? Like, what does that mean? They had questions. They had real questions. But yet they followed Jesus in the unknown. Their questions didn't deter them from taking the next step and following after God. And so what we see with Abram, what we see with Jesus and the disciples, is an invitation to follow. If we had to summarize all this together, here's what it would say. Maybe. There we go. That I can trust God's calling even in the unknown. Would you say that with me? Ready, set, go. I can trust God's calling even in the unknown. Even in the places that are a mystery. Even in the questions we have for God. Even in the things that we're still trying to figure out. Even with all the pieces of our life, of our calling laid on the table. Or just even one piece missing. Whatever's unknown, guess what we can trust? We can trust in God's calling. So to make this statement reality, what do we do? What's the secret to getting this into motion? Instead of going from fighting or freezing to following, what does it take? Friends, simply put, it takes faith. Faith is the catalyst to turn someone into a follower from being someone who's frozen or someone who's fighting it. Faith is the assurance and confidence in things that are not seen. And we live in an age of certainty, so it seems like faith is a lost art now, isn't it? It seems like for us to have faith in something or to believe something, it has to be absolute certainty. But life is uncertain, and there are things of God that are uncertain and mysterious to us because our finite mind just can't comprehend it. So what it takes is faith and trust in the unseen work and power of who God is. And when we begin to display faith, trust and confidence and assurance in who God is, guess what we discover? We discover that our faith is placed in the one who is faithful, meaning he delivers on his promises. He does not leave you or forsake you. He stays with you. And even in the unknown, we can trust God's calling for our life. We can trust the bigger picture of the calling. See, this was my story, down to a T. So as a sophomore in high school, going to be a junior the summer in between, I was on a mission trip in Savannah, Georgia, when for the first time in my life, the only time to this point, I heard the audible voice of God speak out loud. We were sitting in a room. There were all these other churches there, and there was a guy up front teaching and talking about a lesson, and we were sharing glory sightings about the trip. And clear as day, out loud, I heard a voice say, "This is what I want you to do." And it was so clear, I even looked to my friend next to me like, "What'd you just say?" And he looked at me like, "What?" And so I looked back to the front of the room and went, "Okay, that was weird." And not as soon as that thought came in my head, I heard it one more time, the audible voice of God say, "This is what I want you to do." I still get emotional. It still gives me chills thinking about it. And so right after that happened, Heather Evans was our youth pastor at the time. So I went to Heather. I said, "Heather, this weird thing happened. I got to tell you about it." And so from that moment on, it kicked off this journey of me having this bigger picture that God has called me to something. He's called me to something. But not knowing exactly what this is. Like, is this a ministry outside the church, in the church, here, there, anywhere, out of the country? What is this? I had this bigger picture, but I had all these pieces, it felt like, laid out on a table. Trying to look at them all and put them together. And for a lot of years, I couldn't figure it out. There were a lot of times where I was just like, forget it. Forget it. I want to go do my thing now. I want to go be a sports journalist. I want to go watch the Gators at that time win, although now I would watch them lose. I want to go do my own thing. And can I tell you how many times I thought about putting all the pieces back in the box, tearing it up and just forget it? And I'm so grateful I didn't. Because I'd miss out on now 10 years worth of God's grace and blessing through the community and ministry of Grace Church with you all. But when I look back on those days and wonder what kept me going, it was faith. It was understanding that, there's a lot unknown, but it was understanding that there's a bigger picture that God has called me to, and I'm going to trust in the faithful one. And then one day, my second year of college, 4 or 5 years later, the pieces came together. On one day, 3 separate people, 3 separate places, directly told me, I feel like God is telling me to tell you, you need to graduate college early and go work at the local church. I said, okay, God. It felt like I was starting to put the pieces in all together at that point. And I know your life's the same. It might be trying to discern a next step for your business. It might be trying to discern your overall calling for your life. It might be trying to figure out where to go from here in the midst of tragedy. And you've got the pieces of your life all laid out, and you're wondering what's next. Coming from one normal person, imperfect person to another, I want to ask you to just trust in the one who's faithful. Put your faith in a God that is faithful. And even in the unknown, you can trust in God's calling. Let's stand for prayer. God, we're thankful that you hold the many pieces of our life in your hands. God, the pieces that have been broken by tragedy, the pieces that have been broken by unknown, the pieces that are broken by whatever the case may be. God, we're thankful that you hold each and every one in your hand. And Lord, right now, even before we can see it, we know that you're putting them back together for our good. God, I lift up right now those of us who have an unknown that we're facing, those of us who have uncertainty that we're wrestling with, those of us who, God, in this moment, we just don't have confidence. We're ready to put it all back in the box and start over. God, I pray right now in the name of Jesus that we would have a resurgence of faith in you, the faithful one. God, that we would have confidence and assurance in what is unseen, and that's in you right now. Lord, thank you for meeting us in our unknown. We welcome you into it, and we surrender it to you, the one who loves us and knows us most and best. God, it's in your name we pray. Amen. Friends, I want to invite you. We're going to sing one song together. I want to invite you, if you want to make your seat a place of prayer, you can. Or I want to invite you to make your way up to this altar. Maybe you need to come kneel in the presence of God and lift up your unknown to him and invite him to speak to you now. The altar's open. If you want someone to pray with you, just lift a hand. Let's worship together.